Hey guys, welcome to 100 Days of Code, and today we are on day 29 where we're going to be building a password manager. So we're going to be doing this using Tkinter, and the real inspiration for this project came about because I was trying to register for a website where it asked for a password that was just insanely complicated. Something along these lines where it has to be really long, it has to include lots of different things, it can't match your previous passwords, it just has a whole bunch of rules, and I really struggled coming up with a password that actually matched all of their requirements, and by the time that I came up with it, I'd already forgotten what the password was. One of my favorite blogs is Coding Horror by a guy called Jeff Atwood, and you might not know him by name, but you will actually have used something that he's made. He is one of the founders and original creators of Stack Overflow, which I'm sure by now you're well familiar with. And even he was talking about how password rules are just really terrible. They're so long and they're so complicated. And they've even inspired a really good XKCD comic, which essentially tells the truth that through 20 years of effort, we've successfully trained everyone to use passwords that are hard for humans to remember, but easy for computers to guess. This is the crazy state of things. So we're going to be creating a program to combat that. And it's going to be called MyPass, our password manager. And we're going to use it to store and generate passwords. For example, if I wanted to create an account on App Brewery, then I enter the name of the website so that I know what this password is for. I put in my email and username is already pre-populated in my password manager. And then all I have to do is to either come up with a password that is hopefully not terrible, but I can obviously never remember, or I can use the built-in generate password to just generate me a very complex, very long password with all of the required numbers and symbols and all of that. And once I'm done with that, then I can click add and I get a pop-up asking me if this is okay. And if that all looks good, then I click yes, and that data gets added to a text file which I have on my computer. So this is not an internet-based service, and you keep everything locally on your computer, which some people feel is a lot safer than using a third-party service like LastPass or whatever else. So this is what we're trying to build, and it's got some really neat features. For example, it's got some basic validations. So if you, for example, leave one of the fields empty and you click add, you get a pop-up that tells you, please don't leave any of the fields empty. Or if you generate a password, then you can actually immediately use it by pasting it. What's happening behind the scenes is as soon as I click on generate password, then my password is saved onto my clipboard and I can paste it into the password field on the website I'm trying to sign up for. This is what we're going to be building today, and it's going to use everything you've learned about Tkinter, and we're going to be learning some new things that you can do with Tkinter as well. Once you're ready, head over to the next lesson and let's get started. To begin, as always, head over to the course resources and download the starting project as a zip file. Now, once you've unzipped it, open it using PyCharm and go ahead and take a look inside the starting files. I've included a logo image, which is going to be used in our project. And I've got also a very, very blank looking main.py. Now, here comes a challenge already. To start out, we're going to create a window using Tkinter that has a title of Password Manager. And the only thing that it's going to have is just a canvas widget displaying that logo image. So the canvas is going to have a width and height of 200 pixels, and the canvas is going to be padded from the edge of the window by 20 pixels on all four sides. So that way it could look quite centered like this. And this image finally is going to be bang in the center of the canvas. So I want you to think back to what you learned yesterday about the Canvas widget. And in the course resources, I've linked to this page on the Canvas documentation, including that all-important create image method. Have a look through this for what the expected inputs are, and you can also scroll up to see more of the references on other things that you can do with the canvas. or just have a quick look through yesterday's code if you need to. But I want you to be able to create a Tkinter program using all the things that you've learned, and when you run it, it should look pretty much the same as this. Pause the video and complete this challenge. So to begin, we're going to go to the very top of our file, and I'm going to import all of the classes inside Tkinter, and I'm going to use that to do my UI setup. As always, I start out creating a window and then give it a title. And then I'm going to get my window to start out with my main loop. Now in between, I'm going to create my canvas. And this is from the canvas widget. Now this canvas widget, as I mentioned, is going to have a height of 200 and a width of 200. And in addition, it's going to display this logo.png inside as the image. So I'm going to create our logo image from the photo image class, and then I have to provide the file name. So the file name is just simply logo.png in this case, because they're both inside the same folder. So once I've created my image, I can tell my canvas to create an image inside the canvas, and then I can specify the image name, and that is of course going to be my logo image. Now the other thing that I have to do before I can actually run my code, because at the moment it's actually going to give me an error, and the error says tuple index out of range. It's basically expecting some sort of a tuple to work on, and that tuple is to define what the X and Y position is of this image on the canvas. So we do that by simply just adding the raw numbers. So the X position of the center of the image is going to be 100, because remember that the width is 200, so half of that is 100. And similarly for the Y position, it's also going to be 100. So this way we've got the X and Y position defined, and we've created the canvas size. Now all we need to do is to get our canvas to have some sort of layout dimension. So I'm just going to start out by packing my canvas onto the screen, because later on, once we have more components, then we can think about using more fancy things like the grid. Now if I run this as it is, then you can see that I've created my password manager window, and I've created my 200 by 200 canvas. The only requirement I haven't yet satisfied is adding some padding between the window and that canvas. So let's do that using our window.config, and I'm going to set the padding using the pad X and pad Y. And as we mentioned, I'm going to set that to 20 on the X and 20 on the Y. So now we get pretty much exactly the image that you saw in the demonstration, and this is the end result we were looking for. Did you manage to complete this challenge? If not, be sure to review some of the lessons that we learned yesterday, where we went through the canvas widget in great detail. But if you're happy with all of this code, then in the next lesson, we're going to be learning more about the grid system and how to lay out a complex user interface like this one. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there. To go from this to this will require not only some widgets to be added, but a little bit more knowledge about how to lay out our widgets on the grid. Because notice how here we've got a single entry that is spread across the right side of the screen. But then down here, we've got an entry that's only taking up a part of that space. Effectively, if we think about our grid, this particular entry is actually taking up 2 columns. So how can we do this? To demonstrate this, I've created a sandbox app. So it's super simple. All it has is a red label and a green label. And you can see that the red label has a width of 20, a height of 5, as does the green, but the red is on row 0, column 0, whereas the green is on row 1, column 1. So we get this kind of checkered kind of look. If I decide to go and add another label, let's call it B for blue, and I give it a background of blue, and then I give it the same width and height. Now, if I put this new label onto the grid and I put it onto the next row, so row 2, but the column, I'm going to put it on column 0. Now, I think at this point you can probably all predict where that label is going to go. And indeed, it goes onto the very first leftmost column and it's on the third row. Now, what if I wanted that blue label to go across the entire width so that it's below the red and also below the green? Well, you might think that I could simply just double the width, right? Instead of a width of 20, let's change it to 40. Surely that's going to stretch this label so that it goes across the entire red and green label. But unfortunately, when I run this, you'll see instead this happens. The blue label is still within the first column. And in fact, it's stretched that column to a 40 width. And that red column is now centered again in the leftmost or the first column. And that blue is nowhere near the green label because it's not allowed to go into that second column. So how can we solve this situation? Well, the actual answer is another attribute that the grid has, which is something called a column span. Now, the column span is exactly what it sounds like, really. It's basically how many columns is this particular thing going to span. So in our case, we want it to go across two columns, column 0 and column 1. So it should start out at column 0, but then span a whole two columns. And now when I run this code, you can see we get our desired effect. The blue label is now across the red and the green, and it's spanning two columns. The link to this playground is in the course resources, so feel free to head over there and give it a go if you want to play around with this example. Now, in our case, if we break down the final layout we're looking for, it's effectively a 3-column and 5-row layout. So we've already got our canvas, which is actually going to go in the middle, so probably the second column. And then we've got the website, the email username, the password, and finally our 2 buttons. Now, I've laid out this entire user interface and I've specified the width of some of these entries and buttons just because you'll need to do a bit of tweaking around just to make sure that everything lines up with each other. I've already done that ahead of time and I've really worked out the sort of near optimal width. So what I want you to do is to use what we've learned about the grid column span. So if we have our label, our button, new button, and entry, if I want this particular button to go across 2 columns, then I have to change that column span attribute to 2. And I have to specify which column it starts out in and how many columns it's going to go across. Using everything you've learnt so far, I want you to recreate this user interface. Have a look at what's on screen. These are labels, these are entries, and these 2 are buttons. Have a look at where they lie within the grid system and how many columns they go across, and also the width of some of these widgets, and see if you can recreate this user interface in your project. So pause the video and give that a go. Did you have a go at the challenge? Here's what we currently have. And this is what you should have created upon completing the challenge. If you haven't had a go at attempting to recreate this user interface, pause the video now because I'm about to walk you through the solution. Again, we're going to be within the UI setup section, and I'm going to write my code below where I've got my canvas. Now, the first thing I'm going to create are actually all of these labels because they're relatively simple to lay out, and it'll be a quick and easy job. Now I've created 3 labels and it's time to actually put them onto the screen. Now, because I'm going to be using grids, I can't use pack in addition. So I also have to put my canvas onto the grid. The canvas is going to go onto the grid in row 0, the first row at the very top. And in terms of column, it's actually going to be column 1, the middle column. And then going down the list, my website label and my email label and my password label, they're all going to be on subsequent rows. So row 1 and then row 2 and row 3. And they're all going to be in the same column, which is going to be column 0, the very first column. Now, if I run this code and we take a look, you can see that it looks a little bit weird just because this canvas is in column 1 while these labels are in column 0. But that's fine. It's going to even out once we add the other components. That's all the labels done. The next thing are the entries. Now, as I showed you in the slide, these entries will have different widths. So the website entry, this one here, and the email entry are both going to have a width of 35, while the password entry is only going to have a width of 21. Now, remember that the width is a property of the entry class. It's not something that's related to the grid. So if inside this grid method you add something like width, then this is not going to work and it's going to give you an error. So that's a common source of error for students, so be aware. Once we've created our entries, it's time to lay them out using our grid. Now, the first website entry is going to go into the same row as the website label, so that's row 1, but the column is going to be column 1, so it's the next one over. And the email entry is going to be in exactly the same column, but just shifted one row down. And finally, the password entry is going to be on the next row, so row 3, and it's going to be in column 1 as well. Right now, this is what it looks like. And you can see that this doesn't look terribly bad, other than maybe I need to change this to a capital P, and I could probably add a colon to the end of each of these lines, like this. Now, the final step to do is to add the 2 buttons. So one button has to go over here to the right of the password field, and one has to go at the bottom. Now, this generate password button is going to be on the grid, but it's going to be in the 3rd column. And in terms of row, it's going to be on the same row as the password, which is row 3. While the add button is simply going to be in the last row. And this should be a button rather than a radio button. So this is what we have so far. This is clearly not what we wanted to have, which looks more like this. And if I put it side by side, you can see that the add button is far too small. Referring back to this, we need to set the width to 36. So let's go ahead and add that. Now that makes the button a lot wider, but it still doesn't solve the fact that this generate password is actually in a completely different column. While we actually ideally want that button to cover the entire password entry and also the generate password. So we need this button basically to have a column span of 2 so that it spans both of these columns. And in fact, so does the website entry and the email username entry. So let's fix that. The website entry grid is going to have an additional keyword argument, which is the column span, and this is going to be set to 2. And we're going to add that to the email entry when it's on the grid as well. And finally, the add button. So now you can see that we're getting pretty close, right? Once we put in those column spans, you can see our layout has dramatically changed and everything now looks a lot more aligned. Now, the alignment is not perfect because the generate password button is actually just allowed to be the size that it needs to be. And I've tinkered around with some of the widths, and you can of course try out your own width and nudge it around a bit to see if you can change it. But I think in terms of overall look, this is not bad. The only thing I would add is maybe our padding of 20 around the side of the window is actually not enough. Maybe we need to increase it a little bit. If you want to, you can actually change the padding to 50 so that you get a little bit more white space and it looks a little bit less busy. So this is the final design that we're trying to get to. And now that we've set up all of our UI, all that's left to do is to add the functionality. And that is what we're going to do in coming lessons. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now that the UI is all set up, it's time to go on to the next step where we actually can start saving some of this data that the user is entering. So there's a couple of things I want to show you before we get started. Firstly, notice how when we run our code at the moment, it just launches our app. But wouldn't it be nice if the cursor was already within the first text box? That means the user can start typing straight away when they launch the password manager. To do that, you can, of course, dig through the docs, but the easiest way is to get hold of that website entry and then call a method on it called focus. And this will focus the cursor into that particular entry, and you can see that right there. Now, the next thing that would be nice is when you're signing up for lots of websites, at least in my case, I often use just one email to sign up. So wouldn't it be nice if when we launch our password manager, that this email field is already pre-populated with our most commonly used email? Well, we can do that by simply adding a starting value to that email entry. And the way that we do that is through a method called insert. Now, insert takes two parameters. And in fact, you can actually scroll down to the insert method and you can see it describes in detail that it takes an index and also the string that you want to insert. The way that the index works is it's basically where the cursor is. If you wanted to insert it at the very beginning of that email entry, then you could just put in 0. That's basically insert this piece of text at the first 0th character. Alternatively, there's another useful index which is called end. And this end comes from Tkinter constants, and it's just a constant that's going to represent the very last character that's inside that entry. For example, if inside your entry you already had some text and you want to insert it after your text here, then you would use the index as end. But if you want to insert it at the very beginning, then you would use the index as 0. Now, in our case, it shouldn't actually matter because our email entry will start out being completely empty. So I'm going to choose to insert this piece of text at the very beginning. And the text that I'm going to insert is just a example dummy email. This is not my real email, but in your case, if you're creating your own password manager, then you could put down your own email so that every time you run the app, it already starts out being pre-populated with that email that you've got. So now the rest of the challenge is pretty much going to be up to you. Inside this save password section, what I want you to do is to be able to take the inputs that are put into the website entry, the email entry, and the password entry. And when the user clicks on this add button, I want you to somehow figure out how to save that data into a file called data.txt. This data.txt is going to take the website that the user entered, the email that they entered, and the password that they entered. And it's going to put it in here with a space in between and a pipe symbol that you can find on your keyboard. Or in fact, you can format this however you like, because at the end of the day, you're going to be the one looking at this file to find your emails and passwords. So format it in a way that's comfortable for you. But essentially what we want to do is to transport the things that the user types into here, the website that this password is for, their email, and their password. And the moment that they press this add button to trigger some sort of function that saves this information into a data.txt file. And it formats the information like this. And every time the user adds another entry, it's going to be added on a new line and it's going to be appended to the end of the previous entry. So I know that it's been a little while since we last dealt with writing to file. So I'll link to the documentation that's relevant to this challenge. One is how to write to file using Python, and you can see the demo code which you can run and you can try out, and then you're going to format that to work for your particular case. Now the other thing is the Tkinter entry widget. So there is the insert method that's going to be pretty useful. But the other thing that you want to happen is once you press the add button, you want all of this information other than the email to be cleared out. So you're probably also going to have to take a look at the delete function. And at the very top, you can see they even show you how to delete something entirely from an entry. Using these two pieces of documentation, I want you to be able to take this information, put it into a data.txt file, and afterwards wipe clear this website entry and the password entry. So that's all there is to it. There's going to be quite a bit of code writing, so have a think about it and go ahead and complete this challenge. I'll wait for you and we'll go through the solution afterwards together. So the first thing I need to happen is when the user presses on the add button, I need to trigger a function. So in this add button, I'm also going to add a command, and I'm going to call my function save. So I'm going to put that function inside the section save password. Now this save function is going to write to a file which is called data.txt, or in fact, you can call it anything you want. Inside the save function, we want to be able to write to a particular file. So we need to open the file and then we need to write to it. And we can use the option A to append to the end of the file, or write, which overwrites any existing content, or read, which just reads the actual file. Now in our case, every time we add a new password, we want to add it to the previous passwords. So we're going to need this append. So let's go ahead and open a file, which we're going to call data.txt, and we're going to open it using the append mode. Now remember that when you're opening a file using the append mode or the write mode, and that file doesn't exist, it's simply going to create it. We're going to open this, and you can either save it to a file name, so you could do it like this, data file equals open, or you might have remembered that previously we spoke about the with keyword. So we can say with open this particular data file as our data file. And what this allows us to do is it will close this file automatically without us having to later write file.close. So it's a much better way of working with files. But if you didn't remember the with keyword, don't worry, using the open will still work. Now, once we've opened our data.txt in append mode, the next step is to actually add the pieces of data. Now, how do we get hold of data from our entries? Well, that's where the entry documentation comes in handy. And you can see even at the very top, it tells you that to fetch the current entry text, use the get method. So the entry.get. We can get hold of our website by getting hold of the website entry and then calling .get. And then we can do the same for email and password. Once we've gotten all of these pieces of text, then we're going to be writing it into our file. So our data file dot write, and what we're going to write is a string, which I'm going to format using an F string. And I'm first going to put in the website, and then space and pipe symbol, space, and then it's going to be the email. And finally, it's going to be the password. Let's check this out. Let's run it and see if it works. Let's say we're signing up for Amazon. I'm going to use my normal username and I'm going to create a password, which is super insecure, which you should never use. But now I'm going to click on add. And after I've clicked it, even though nothing has happened so far, if we take a look inside our project folder, you can see we've now magically created this data.txt file. And you can see it's formatted our website, email, and password all into that file. So that's pretty much a success. Now, the other thing I mentioned is that it would be nice to get some sort of indication that it worked, right? And for our application to be prepped and ready for the next piece of data to be entered. So we wanted to delete whatever text is inside the website entry and the password entry. If we take a look again at the documentation, you can see that you can delete whatever is inside the entry by calling delete and telling it to delete from a particular index to another index. Now, there's more detail if you actually scroll down to the actual method, and it tells you that it takes two parameters, first and last. First is the start of the range, and last is the end of the range. And it tells you that if you omit it, it's only going to remove one character. So that's not what we want. We want it to remove all of the characters in a particular entry. So let's start out with our website entry called delete on it. And we're going to start from index 0 and go all the way to the end. In the same way that we used our index when we inserted our email to the email entry, we moved the cursor to the very start, the 0th character in that entry. In this case, we're deleting from the 0th character to the end of the entry. And then we can do the same for our password entry. And now if we run this code, you can see that once I type something in, and let's just generate another bad password, QWERTY. And by the way, if I've called out any of your passwords, just for my sake, and definitely for your own security, go ahead and change it. These are really bad passwords. But either way, I'm going to click add, and you can see the moment that I've clicked that, my website and my password entries have now cleared out, and it's now ready to take the next entry. And back in my data.txt, I've now got another entry. But notice this, it's been added to the end of the previous entry, but it's on the same line. That's a little bit confusing. Now, you might remember this special character, which is \n. And that allows us to enter things onto a new line. Let's delete everything that we've got in here so far, and let's hit save so that we can start from scratch. Now let's run our program with that new line inserted. And if I go ahead and add the website, and let me think of another bad password. Password is a really terrible password. Now if I click add, you'll notice that those fields disappear and that the password gets added into here. Now if I try and add another value in here, so let's say, then you can see that the next value got added in on the next line, which is a lot better in terms of formatting. These are just small things that make things look tidy and neat. But the big part was remembering how to save things into a file and using the documentation to get hold of the values inside our entries and putting it into our data file. One of the things you might have realized is that it's a terrible user experience when the user enters a piece of data, say a website and a password, and they click add. Things sort of disappear, but they don't really have a confirmation that this in fact did work. So in the next lesson, we're going to look at how we can create some pop-ups so that we can show the user what the result was of their action. We can tell them if it was successful or if it was not, ask them to confirm whether if they're happy with their data entry. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, in the last lesson, we managed to get our password manager to start saving the data that we're entering inside the password manager. And we formatted it and put it inside our data.txt. Now, one of the things that was a bit of an issue in terms of user experience is whenever the user actually enters their details into this password manager at the moment, it doesn't actually give you some sort of way of knowing that it was successful or if it was not, or actually getting them to check and verify that the data that they've entered is definitely the one that they want to save into the file. In order to do this, we're going to learn about something else that you can do with Tkinter. which is something called standard dialogues. These are basically pop-ups that your Tkinter program can generate. And one of the most popular standard dialogues are the message boxes. And it's really, really easy to create these pop-ups. You can simply just import the message box module, and you can tap into methods like show info or show warning, show error, or you can ask the user yes, no, or okay or cancel, ask a question, yes or no, ask to retry or cancel. Now, the screenshots were made in a Swedish version of Windows, but we can actually try these out ourselves and start putting in some standard dialogues so that we can give the user some feedback. The thing that we really want to tell the user is the moment that the save function is called, it's because they pressed on the add button here. But before we actually commit all of the current information to the file, we want to check and make sure that they're actually happy with what they've written. So we can create a message box here and get them to check the details that they've entered and then hit yes or no as to whether if they want to save it. In order to use the message box, we actually have to import the message box. Again, it's from the Tkinter module that we're going to import the message box module. Now, notice how this is not actually a class. So that's why, even though we've said asterisk, which means import everything, it actually only imports all of the classes, the constants, but it doesn't import things like the message box, which is simply just another module of code. And in fact, if you right click on it and go to implementation here, then you can actually see this messagebox.py file and how it's implemented. The thing that's important though is to actually put it into use. So we can use the message box and call a method to show a pop-up. The simplest type is just show info, which you only need to think about two things really, a title and also a message. So I'm just going to put title as title and message as message. And you can see when I press add, I get this pop-up and it's just got the title and the message, and you can't do anything other than click OK. In addition to show info, there's actually a lot of other methods. You can ask yes or no, ask retry or cancel. You can show an error or you can show a warning. Now, in addition, you can actually ask the user something. So this generates two buttons, yes or no, retry or cancel, okay or cancel. Ask question is also yes and no. And we've also got yes, no, and cancel here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask okay or cancel. And what I want to ask the user is I'm going to set the title as the website that they've entered. So that's going to come from here. And then I'm going to set the message as a f-string. So I'm going to say these are the details entered, colon, new line, and then I'll give them the email that they entered, and then a new line, and the password that they entered. And then after a new line, I'm going to ask them, is it okay to save? If I go ahead and run this code, you can see that when I type a website, say Amazon, and I type in my password and I click add, I get my pop-up and it says, these are the details entered, this is the email, this is the password, is it okay to save? Now, what I want to do is when they click OK, then for that action to go through and for us to write to our data file. But if they click cancel, I want them to be able to go back to the screen and edit it if necessary. In order to do that, we have to receive the output from this method call, which is going to be a Boolean. It's going to be either true or false. So I'm going to set that to is okay. Now, if this is okay is true, well, in that case, we're going to go ahead and do all of this. So write to file and delete everything that's inside the entry. But if it's not okay, then we're simply just going to do nothing, and the pop-up box will dismiss itself. Now, if I run this code again and I type in some gobbledygook and I click add, you can see if I click cancel, nothing happens, I go back. But if I click OK, then all of that information is going to be added to my data.txt, like here. Now it's time for you to have a go with the message boxes and these standard dialogues. But your job is to figure out how can we get our app to have a little bit of validation. Because when they have an empty website and an empty password and they click add, you shouldn't really let them save an empty password and an empty website, right? That's not right. So we want to check to see if the length of the entries in the website or the password is 0. And in that case, we're going to bring up a message box that's just going to tell them basically that, hey, you've left some fields empty. So this is what you're aiming for. Let's say that you've left the website or the password empty and you click add. You should get a pop-up that tells you, hey, don't leave any of the fields empty. And this should trigger when either the website or the password is empty. So have a think about how you might solve that challenge and give it a go. All right, so here is where we get all of the information from our entries. And this is also a good time to do this validation. We can use an if statement to check, well, if this website string has a length of 0, then that means the user didn't type anything in there. And we can use an or statement to check, well, if the password also has a length of 0, well, in that case, they didn't type anything in there either. Now you can also add a validation for the email, but because we have the email already pre-populated, there's actually not much point here. So if either they've left the website blank or the password blank, then we're going to generate a message box, and we're going to use the show info message box. The title is just going to say, oops, and the message is going to say, please make sure you haven't left any fields empty. And now when you run this code, if you've left either of these two empty, then you're going to get a pop-up that tells you this. Now, we don't actually want the rest of this code to happen if this is true. So let's go ahead and add an else statement as well so that we can indent all of this so that we only continue forwards if, in fact, the length of the website or the password is not equal to 0. So in this case, when they leave it empty, you can say OK, and it just goes back to let you continue entering more details. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to add another piece of functionality to our application, which is the generate password. We've already seen how terrible the passwords are that we come up with from our own heads. So we're going to be using the generate password code that we created many, many moons ago as one of our projects, and we're going to be embedding that into this application. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, what may seem like a long time ago, we created a password generator project. So this was in fact on day 5, where we took 3 lists, letters, numbers, and symbols, and we used it to generate a random list of letters, symbols, and numbers, and then we shuffled all of those together and we turned it into a string to create a very secure password. Now, I've modified the code a little bit just so that we don't need to use any input, so we don't have to type anything in the console. Instead, I've created a random number between 8 and 10 to pick 8 or 10 letters, and then 2 to 4 numbers and 2 to 4 symbols. So what I want you to do is to head over to this link, which is in the course resources, and simply just copy everything that's in there into your password generator section, because we're going to be using this code in our password manager, so that when the user clicks on this button, we can generate them a random password and already pre-populate that field. So they don't have to type anything and they don't have to come up with a really complex password like this. Once we've put our password generator code into the password generator section, let's go ahead and reformat it. So let's put our imports at the top. And as a challenge, I want you to take a look at these 3 lines. Look at what they're doing. We've created an empty list and we're adding a random letter from this list of letters. And then we have this for loop, which basically creates a range from this random number, so anywhere between 8 to 10. And then we add a random letter to that password list. So this is a really good opportunity for using list comprehensions instead, because we can get rid of a lot of these for loops and do each of these things in just one single line of code. It is also a good point for a bit of revision. I want you to have a think about how these things work and see if you can do the same thing by changing these 3 sections into 3 list comprehensions. If you're successful, once you run the code, it should still work exactly the same way, and you should see a random password being generated and printed down here. Pause the video and give that a go. All right, so what I'm going to do is, instead of creating an empty list, I'm going to create 3 new lists. One is going to be the password letters. And this list is going to be created, of course, using list comprehension and replacing these 2 lines of code. Remember our keyword format. So we have our new item for item in list. Now, in this case, our list is actually not a list. It's actually going to be a range, because we're going to create a range using this random number. So we generate a range between 0 and this number -1. So we can pass in our number letters into here. Each of the items is actually not important. We don't actually need to use it, so we can just use an underscore to replace it. But what is important is what the new item is going to be, because this is going to be created from random.choice, and we're going to be passing in our list of letters up here, so that we pick a random letter and we put it into our new list, password letters. And then we're going to check to see how many times we need to do this by looking at the range. That line will replace these 2 lines of code. And we can go ahead and do the same thing for the other 2 sections. These 3 lines of code uses list comprehension to replace these for loops. So we can delete those for loops, and now we end up with 3 lists. Now we want to combine these 3 lists into one list so that we can actually shuffle it. So I'm going to create again this password list, and it's going to be created by adding our password letters to our password symbols and our password numbers. So we're basically adding all these 3 lists together and putting it into one big list, and then we're shuffling it up in order to get the final random list. Now we can actually cut down on this code even further if we wanted to. For example, instead of creating a separate variable here, we could actually put it straight in like this. And instead of calling random.randint, we can actually say from random import the methods that we need, which is choice and randint, and also down here we're using the shuffle function as well. So now we can delete all the places where we have random, and we can replace these with just simply the randint. And we can delete these 3 lines of code. And finally, it's simply just shuffle, and we shuffle our password list. Now, one last thing that I think is a good thing to point out is here we've created an empty string called password, and then for each of the characters in our list, we've basically added it to this password. Now that's easy enough, but these 3 lines could actually be done in a more Pythonic way. In Python, there is a method called join, which is available on every single string. So you could take a string like the £, and you could call the join method on it. And what it does is it will create a new string that combines all of the elements in this iterable, John, Peter, and Vicky, and it will separate them by whatever character you put here. Now, this doesn't actually have to be a tuple. It could be a dictionary, and it could also be a list. Let me convert this into a list. And now if I go ahead and use the pound sign to join my list and run this code, you can see I end up with the same result. Now, what if I actually delete this pound sign and I just have an empty string? Well, this will work as well. And what it does, it will join all of the elements in that list with no separation. That's basically what we're trying to do here, right? So instead of all of this, I can simply just write empty space dot join and then pass in my list, which is my password list, and this would be equal to my password. And that replaces all of these lines of code. Right now, if I run my code as it is, you can see I still generate my password and it still is super secure and super long. And in fact, you can modify that by changing how many password letters you want, how many symbols, how many numbers, and you can change these up to make it even more secure. But we've greatly shortened this code from our day 5's work because we now know things like list comprehensions, and we've now learned the join method as well. So this entire section is our password generator mechanism. If we embed all of this inside a function, so we could call it generate password, which is what it's pretty much going to do, then we can call this function when the user presses on that generate password button. So let's add another command and add in our generate password function here. Now, what we don't want though is we don't want to print out the password. That's not very useful for the user who's using a graphical user interface. Instead, we want to populate this entry with the password. Do you remember how to do that? If you do, pause the video and complete this as a challenge. If you don't, I'm going to show you how to do it. So it's the same way as what we did with our email. Remember how we wanted our email entry to have a starting value, the user's email? Well, we'll do the same thing here. So we can tap into our password entry and we call the method insert. Now, the position that we want to insert our text is going to be at the very start, so the 0th character. And the text that we want to insert into it is, of course, our newly created password. So now if I run my code, you can see as soon as I click on this button, a random and beautifully complex password gets generated and populated in here. Now, whenever I sign up for a new website, then I can simply just type in the name of the website, generate my password, and hit add, and I'm already done. Now we've incorporated our generate password functionality, we're able to save our data to our data file. The very last thing I want to show you, which is a really neat trick that you can do with Python, is the ability to put strings into the clipboard so that once we click generate password, this entire string, I don't actually have to go ahead and highlight it and then copy it and then get hold of it, because in most cases, once I've generated my password, I want to be able to immediately paste it into somewhere where I'm signing up for, right? I want to be able to just simply hit paste. So how can we do that? Well, we can use a Python project which is called Paperclip. And this is a cross-platform Python module that just makes it so easy to work with copy and pasting for clipboard functions. All we have to do is import it, and then we say copy, and we pass in the text to be copied. Or you can hit paste, and it'll paste whatever is in the clipboard. We're only really interested in these two parts. So 2 lines of code gets us that functionality. Going back to our code, scrolling to the very top, let's go ahead and import our Paperclip. Make sure that you spelt it right. You can check it against this link, which I've got in the course resources. And once we type that, you can see that PyCharm is already telling us you don't have this package, so go ahead and install it. Once it's been successfully installed, it's a very small module, then we can use it. And the part where we're going to use it is when we generate our password. So once we've generated our password, we're going to call Piperclip, and we're going to call the copy method. Now inside here, we have to put the text that we want to copy into the clipboard, which is going to be the password. So now when we hit run and I generate a new password, right now that password is already in my clipboard, and I can show you just by pasting it into here with Command V. That makes it so much easier to work with our password manager, because all we have to do when we want to sign up to a new account is to simply specify the website name, and then we've already got our email saved and we've got our password generated ready to paste into here. So that should make it a lot easier to have very secure passwords, and also a place to check on what those passwords are when you forget. I hope you enjoyed building this project with me today, and that you're going to put this into good use and make sure that all of your websites and all of your data and all of your accounts are secured with a good quality password.